You wore my thing for it.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Shoot, a fella could have a pretty good weekend in Vegas with all that stuff.
Do you remember that feeling? Late at night, the TV screen slightly blurred and Dr. Strangelove begins with long, solemn lines of text, like a satirical military communique. Then Peter Sellers appears. A balding president with a voice so soft it seems almost harmless. A courteous British officer. And finally, a man in a wheelchair whose right arm refuses to obey him. But behind all that lies a completely different battlefield. A film made when the world was closer to the nuclear brink than at any other time. A fictional war room so convincing that the Pentagon had to examine it as if it were classified material. A real-life accident that nearly triggered nuclear war, forcing the military to quietly change its procedures after the film's release. And a lead actor pushed so far that he suffered a mental breakdown and was quietly removed from the film. Below are 20 of the strangest, most mysterious and darkest facts about Dr. Strangelove. And if this film ever left an impression on you, hit like before we open the first truth. 20. The war room so real the Pentagon had to investigate. The first time we see the war room in Dr. Strangelove, it feels simply impressive, beautiful, monumental and unmistakably cinematic. A massive round table, screens hanging high as if monitoring the entire world. Cold even lighting with no dark corners to hide in. But when the film was released, some US officials were genuinely alarmed. Almost immediately, a question surfaced internally. Where did Kubrick get this information? The issue was accuracy, the room's layout, the way people sit facing one another, the placement of the decision maker, the note taker, the one waiting for orders, the tense yet emotionally detached atmosphere where the fate of tens of millions of lives is discussed like a technical problem. Everything was right to a disturbing degree. Stanley Kubrick didn't need classified documents. He reasoned it out logically, the logic of power structures, who speaks, who listens, who waits for a decision. The logic of military psychology discipline chains of command, and the fear of appearing weak. And the logic of systems where people are just components and decisions must look reasonable on paper. Put those three together, and the war room emerges naturally, not as a cinematic invention, but as an inevitable consequence. And that is what truly frightens people. Because the real room in real life might well look exactly like that, a place bright enough, orderly enough, and rational enough to make people forget they are discussing the end of the world. 19. Peter Sellers' 3 roles and a psychological collapse. The first time they watched Dr. Strangelove, many people laughed when they realise Peter Sellers is everywhere. A reserved British officer. A US president so polite he seems weak. And Dr. Strangelove in a wheelchair with a right arm that jerks as if carrying buried political memories. 3 roles, 3 men. A seemingly effortless act of performance magic. But behind it was a mind stretched to its absolute limit. Sellers wasn't just playing multiple roles, he was living multiple roles at the same time. And the cost was enormous. He was paid $1 million, about 55% of the film's total budget, an almost unprecedented figure in the early 1960s. Stanley Kubrick later joked, "I got 3 people for the price of 6. It wasn't just professional banter. It revealed how Kubrick viewed actors as expressive tools that could be divided, stretched and exhausted as long as the result was right. Kubrick knew Sellers had a tendency to dissolve into his roles. He knew Sellers was psychologically vulnerable, and he still treated that vulnerability as efficiency. When preparations began for a 4th role, Major Kong, everything started to crack. Sellers suffered prolonged anxiety, insomnia, forgotten lines, and frequent lateness to costume fittings. Then one day, he couldn't stand up. The official statement said he had injured his ankle. In reality, Sellers had entered a state of psychosomatic paralysis caused by extreme anxiety, his body refusing to endure the pressure any longer. And that is the bitter paradox of Dr. Strangelove, a film about systems that crush human beings, created through the quiet crushing of a real human being. 18. Miss Scott almost entirely cut down. Do you remember the young secretary who appears only briefly in Dr. Strangelove, lying in bed, answering the phone, speaking to the President of the United States while still half asleep? A scene that is both funny and empty. What few people know is that Miss Scott was not originally like this at all. In early cuts and production notes, Miss Scott's role was noticeably longer. She had more lines, more everyday moments, enough material to feel like a person, not just an image. And then Stanley Kubrick cut almost everything. He kept exactly 2 things: the bed scene and a few sexually suggestive lines that lead to no emotion whatsoever. No backstory, no depth, no chance for the audience to understand or empathise. Miss Scott was never meant to be a character. That was intentional. Kubrick did not want the audience to care about Miss Scott. In the same film, men in suits discuss the deaths of tens of millions in a cold, technical, professional tone. Meanwhile, a woman exists only as decoration for power and is trimmed down until she is no longer a person at all. 17. Merkin Muffley, the obscene wordplay hidden in the president's name. There is a detail in Dr. Strangelove that most viewers never notice, not because it's obscure, but because it is hidden so cleverly. The name of the US president in the film is Merkin Muffley. At first glance, it seems harmless, almost silly, neutral enough to pass by without leaving a trace. But Stanley Kubrick never chose names at random. Merkin is an old term for a pubic wig historically used to conceal disease or for adornment. Muff is slang for female genitalia. Put together, Merkin Muffley becomes a linguistic stab, dirty, discreet, and subtle enough to slip past censorship. Kubrick didn't need this character to be a clown on screen. The name alone does the work. Even the leader of the free world, the man who speaks politely to the Soviet premier, who calls for calm, who tries to preserve an image of morality and civility, is in Kubrick's eyes still a joke wrapped in ceremony. 16. The real-life B-52 incident. The tragedy Dr. Strangelove only dared to tell halfway. If you've ever watched the scene where Major Kong is unable to abort the mission in Dr. Strangelove, you might think it's exaggerated satire. But in real life, there was a moment when human beings had to dismantle their own system to prevent the end of the world. This was not a minor malfunction. It was an incident that nearly triggered a real nuclear catastrophe. During the Cold War, the United States kept B-52 bombers carrying live thermonuclear weapons on continuous airborne patrol, always on alert. One of these aircraft was struck by lightning or suffered a severe electrical failure. The bomb's safety sequence began to activate on its own. The order from command was brief and absolute: do not return to base. If the bomb detonated during landing, it would explode over Allied territory. The most horrifying part only became known later that B-52 was equipped with an automatic bomb release mode integrated into the navigation computer. If certain mission complete conditions were met, altitude coordinates, wartime status, the bomb could drop without the pilot pressing a single button. The crew knew this, and they physically cut the wires that could trigger the bomb, not through standard procedure, not via a safety switch, but by manual action inside a cramped cockpit with a live thermonuclear weapon ready to go. Kubrick didn't invent the idea of bombs falling because of systems. He simply didn't tell us that there was a time when people had to cut bomb wires with their bare hands to save the world. 15. 6 cameras for a moment that would never happen twice. Do you remember that final scene when Dr. Strangelove suddenly rises from his wheelchair, his right arm jerking uncontrollably, and blurts out a line that is both hilarious and chilling? Mein Führer, I can walk. The moment feels like a perfect lock, a punchline, a symbol, a belated confession from the entire 20th century. What almost no one knows is that there was no guarantee this scene would ever exist. Throughout the filming of Dr. Strangelove, Peter Sellers improvised much of his dialogue, and for this climactic moment he told Stanley Kubrick something that would make any director go cold. I can't do it exactly the same way twice, and I can't do it more than 2 or 3 times. In other words, if the moment wasn't captured, it would be gone forever. The problem was that this was the peak of the entire film, the point where every idea, every theme, every madness converged. Kubrick's solution fit the spirit of the film, perfectly extreme and deeply distrustful of total control. He lined up 6 cameras in a row with a single command roll and missed nothing. When Sellers stepped into the scene, everything unfolded like a legally recorded accident. His body jerked involuntarily. His right arm rose in an unconscious Nazi salute. And then, almost against his own will, the character stood up. No one on set knew it was about to happen. Not even Peter Sellers himself. 14. The film crew, almost mistaken for Soviet spies over Greenland. Few people realised there were moments when the boundary between film and real life nearly collapsed completely. And it didn't happen in the war room, but in the skies over Greenland. While shooting aerial footage for Dr. Strangelove, a secondary film crew was sent to fly over the North Atlantic near Greenland to capture airborne shots for the film's strategic backdrop. While the cameras were rolling, the lens inadvertently captured images of a secret US military base, one that did not appear on any public map. And that was enough. The response was almost immediate. The camera aircraft was forced to make an emergency landing. Communications were cut. The crew was detained and interrogated. The questions were blunt and not cinematic at all. Who are you? Who are you filming for? And how do you know this place exists? In the atmosphere of the early 1960s, only one explanation sounded reasonable. Soviet spies. No one cared what film they were making. No one laughed at the title Dr. Strangelove. The irony was brutal. They were shooting a comedy about accidental nuclear war, a story about paranoia, suspicion, and overreacting systems. Meanwhile, in real life, they were pulled straight into the very security paranoia of the Cold War. 13. A real stumble that became the perfect portrait of power. There is a moment in the war room of Dr. Strangelove that most of us remember clearly, but very few know it wasn't in the script. General Buck Turgidson is in full flow, loud voice, aggressive gestures, his body always leaning forward ready to charge. Then he trips. Not a staged fall, no musical cue, no comedic cut. George C. Scott falls flat right in front of the war room table. But he doesn't stop. He gets up immediately and continues his speech as if nothing happened. The crucial detail this moment was never written. It was a real accident. Behind the camera, Stanley Kubrick misread the moment in the most perfect way possible. He thought Scott was acting portraying a warmonger who is both ridiculous and dangerous, someone willing to ignore personal embarrassment to keep talking about the destruction of the world. So Kubrick kept the shot in the final cut. Only later did the crew confirm Scott truly stumbled, and his instinctive reaction standing up and continuing accidentally became the most precise metaphor for power. 12. The line that nearly got the film banned after JFK. Dr. Strangelove was originally scheduled for release in late November 1963. Then November 22nd happened. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Within hours, everything changed, not just the release date, but the meaning of individual lines of dialogue. In one scene inside the B-52 cockpit, Major Kong jokes about the survival kit a fella could have a pretty good weekend in Dallas with all that stuff. The line had been filmed months before the assassination, but after November 22nd, Dallas was no longer a neutral place name. It became a national wound. Columbia Pictures immediately demanded that Kubrick remove the line, otherwise the film risked being banned outright. Kubrick agreed. His solution was characteristically precise. He brought Slim Pickens back for a single afternoon to re-record just one word. Dallas became Vegas. One word changed, and the entire film was saved. 11. The film that forced the real world to correct itself. When Dr. Strangelove hit theatres, audiences laughed. Somewhere else, no one laughed at all. Inside military and strategic planning institutions, the first reaction was not outrage at being satirized, but silence. Then came a very familiar systemic reflex reviewing procedures. What kept them awake was not exaggeration. It was the fact that for the first time the public could clearly see lethal flaws that had previously been discussed only in technical language behind closed doors. Real changes followed quietly but concretely. First, the authority to launch nuclear weapons was tightened. Next, automated mechanisms were questioned. Finally, layers of cross-verification were strengthened. Dr. Strangelove made too many people realize at once that if this sounds reasonable in a movie, then it once sounded reasonable in real life. And sometimes that single moment of recognition is enough to force a system to slow down before it loses the chance to fix itself. 10. The actor who didn't know he was in a comedy. Anyone who has seen Dr. Strangelove remembers the image of a man in a cowboy hat riding a nuclear bomb, like a horse, yelling as he plunges from the sky before vanishing in an explosion. It's one of the film's funniest moments. What makes it far more disturbing is this: the man did not think he was acting in a comedy. The actor playing Major Kong was Slim Pickens, a former rodeo performer who specialized in cowboys accustomed to portraying plain-spoken, patriotic American heroes. When Pickens read his now iconic lines about confronting the Ruskies, he believed he was inspiring a flight crew carrying out a heroic mission. The other actors were instructed not to break that illusion, and it was precisely that absolute sincerity that created the paradox. Major Kong is funny because he believes completely in the system that is leading him to the end of the world, and that is the core reason Dr. Strangelove is both hilarious and terrifying. 9. The consultant who knew too much. Herman Kahn. There was one man who entered Dr. Strangelove not as an artist, but as someone already accustomed to thinking about the end of the world. His name was Herman Kahn. Kahn worked at the Rand Corporation, a place where people didn't debate whether war should happen, but how many deaths would still be considered acceptable. When Kahn came to the Dr. Strangelove set, he didn't bring cinematic inspiration. He brought real war scenarios, first strike plans, the order in which cities would be targeted, radiation models, and environmental consequences lasting decades. Most frightening of all, Kahn described an automated system designed to unleash destruction, if attacked impossible to deactivate, meant to guarantee the enemy's annihilation as a form of absolute deterrence. Stanley Kubrick carried that logic into the film almost intact. 8. The Pentagon screening where no one laughed. Before Dr. Strangelove was released to the public, Stanley Kubrick agreed to a private screening at the Pentagon. In the room were 37 military officers and senior defense officials, not moviegoers, not critics, but the very people operating the system the film depicted. The film began. And something strange happened. No one laughed. No chuckles at the absurdity. No reaction when generals argued like children. No one treated it as a joke. When the lights came back on, the room remained silent. A few days later, Kubrick received an official request to delay the film's release for reasons of national security. What frightened them was not that the film exaggerated too much, but that it was too accurate. Dr. Strangelove didn't unsettle them because it was offensive. It terrified them because for the first time a film spoke the truth they had long pretended to call by another name. 7. The B-52 cockpit so accurate it triggered an investigation. When Dr. Strangelove premiered, one detail went unnoticed by audiences but made the United States Air Force stop and look very closely. The B-52 cockpit, because it was too accurate. The instrument panels, the placement of levers, the distance between seats and controls. Everything matched almost perfectly, despite the fact that in the early 1960s, the B-52 was classified military hardware, and its interior details were not publicly available. An internal review was conducted by the US Air Force. They examined the production design team. The final conclusion was phrased cautiously. A leak may have occurred but cannot be proven. Years later, engineers who had worked on real B-52s watched the film again and remarked, "They got almost everything right except the position of one switch." And that small inaccuracy is precisely what kept Kubrick from ever being charged, because sometimes being slightly wrong is the safest way to tell the truth. 6. The hotline that didn't yet exist. In Dr. Strangelove, there is a scene that gives the audience a sense of reassurance, at least for a few minutes. The President of the United States picks up the phone and calls the Soviet Premier directly. The two speak through a hotline, and that is precisely why few people noticed the disturbing detail when Kubrick shot that scene. The hotline did not yet exist. The Cuban Missile Crisis occurred in October 1962. The agreement to establish a direct communication link was signed afterward, but the system did not actually become operational until August 1963. Kubrick filmed President Muffley's phone call before it was real. What is chilling is this: when the real hotline finally went into operation, its usage protocol, calm tone, careful choice of words. The presence of interpreters looked eerily similar to the film. Some communications officers later admitted that they had watched Dr. Strangelove before drafting the real procedures. 5. Kubrick exploiting Peter Sellers' heart condition. When Peter Sellers played Dr. Strangelove, the spasms, rapid breathing and loss of control on screen looked like extraordinary acting. But not all of it was acting. Sellers had a heart condition. Stanley Kubrick knew this. In the most intense scenes, Kubrick deliberately scheduled long, uninterrupted takes. There were stretches where Sellers had to perform continuously for 12 to 20 minutes under extreme physical strain. After each take, Sellers was drenched in sweat, gasping for air, often clutching his chest. A doctor was always standing by. And Kubrick asked for another take. What appears on screen, the panic, the loss of control, the body betraying the will, is not entirely fabricated. Kubrick believed that when an actor's body reached its real limits, the camera would capture something that could not be faked. Sellers did not agree, and he never forgave Kubrick for turning a real human being's pain into a perfect performance. 4. The Soviet Union's dead hand. The doomsday machine in Dr. Strangelove sounds like a mad joke, an automated system that launches nuclear war if attacked and cannot be shut down. But Kubrick did not invent it. While the film was being made, the Soviet Union was quietly developing a system with almost identical functionality, later known in the West as Dead Hand. Its logic was simple and terrifying. If sensors detected a nuclear explosion on Soviet territory, and if contact with leadership was lost, the system would automatically launch the remaining nuclear arsenal. No humans required, no possibility of intervention. The system became operational in 1985, more than 20 years after Dr. Strangelove. When Cold War historians later learned of Dead Hand's existence, the reaction was nearly unanimous. Kubrick had anticipated reality by decades. But in truth, he was not prophesying. He simply understood where the logic of nuclear deterrence would lead if pushed to its ultimate conclusion. 3. The green tablecloth and the poker game that decided the world. In Dr. Strangelove, the war room overwhelms viewers with its scale and coldness. But there was one small detail Stanley Kubrick cared deeply about: the green tablecloth. Kubrick insisted that the central table be covered in green, like a poker table. Not for aesthetics, not for lighting, but for psychology. He wanted the actors standing around that table to subconsciously feel as if they were playing a high-stakes card game. Every decision placed on the table represented millions of lives. They spoke softly, they calculated, they raised with numbers, probabilities and strategic advantages, just like a poker game, where the loser is never themselves. Many actors later admitted they weren't playing the feeling of apocalypse. They were playing the cold concentration of a familiar game. And that was Kubrick's most vicious satire. The end of the world in the hands of institutions does not arrive as tragedy. It arrives as a game played very seriously when no one leaves the table until everything has been wagered. 2. The cut ending the pie fight finale. Very few people know that Dr. Strangelove was not originally designed to end with nuclear explosions. Kubrick first shot a different ending, a massive pie fight in the war room. Generals, politicians, military advisors, all plunging into childish chaos. Pies flying everywhere. President Muffley getting hit square in the face. The Soviet ambassador smashing a pie into Dr. Strangelove. The scene took 5 days to shoot and used thousands of pies. According to the actors, it was the funniest scene they had ever participated in. But when Kubrick reviewed the footage, he ordered it all cut. Not because it wasn't funny, but because it was too funny. Kubrick realised that if audiences laughed until the very end, they would leave the theatre relieved. He did not want that. He wanted them to leave with the image of mushroom clouds, with the feeling that no punchline could save the world. 1. The secret Kubrick carried to the end of his life. Throughout his life, Stanley Kubrick insisted that Dr. Strangelove was satire, that he exaggerated nuclear war scenarios for comic effect. That was a necessary lie. In 1998, many years after Kubrick's death, declassified US Air Force documents revealed that in the early 1960s, the authority to launch nuclear weapons had at times been pre-delegated to lower-ranking officers. If contact with Washington was lost, they had the power to order an attack themselves. This is exactly the premise of Dr. Strangelove. Kubrick knew it while making the film, and he chose to call the truth a comedy, because if he had told it plainly, the world would not have been able to endure it. 60 Years on Dr. Strangelove is still often described as a masterpiece of black comedy. The further we move from the Cold War, the more it resembles the present. Not because the world has become worse, but because we are still living inside systems built on the same logic. And laughter, in the end, is simply the last way human beings avoid screaming. What about you? Which detail from the film gave you the deepest chill? Leave a comment below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our upcoming videos.